The morning I discovered my wedding had been canceled. I wasn't standing in a bridal boutique or sipping coffee with my maid of honor. I was sitting alone in my car outside my office, staring at my phone after missing 3 calls from an unfamiliar number. When I finally answered, the woman on the other end introduced herself as Danielle, the event manager from Willow Creek Estate. "Emma," she said gently, "before we release your wedding date to another couple, I wanted to make sure the cancellation request was really yours." For several seconds, I couldn't even understand the sentence. My what? The cancellation. We received it this morning from the person listed as the financial guarantor. I felt every muscle in my body lock. There has to be some mistake. "I'm so sorry," she replied. The caller identified herself as your mother and confirmed all the reservation details. My mother. She hadn't postponed the wedding. She hadn't discussed anything with me. She had erased it. And she never bothered to tell me. I ended the call without another word. Outside my windshield, people walked past laughing, carrying coffee cups, living perfectly ordinary mornings while mine had just collapsed. But here's the part nobody in my family ever expected. I didn't cry. Not there. Not later that afternoon. Not even after I confirmed every terrible detail. Instead, I started making a list. By the time my mother, my father, and my older sister were desperately asking why they hadn't received invitations to the ceremony they assumed no longer existed, our wedding had already been rebuilt. Without them, this isn't just the story of a canceled wedding. It's the story of the day I finally stopped begging my family to love me the way I deserved. Stay with me, because the ending changed every relationship in my life. I grew up in Savannah, Georgia, where reputation carried almost as much weight as family itself. My mother, Vivian Harper, believed appearances solved everything. If people admired your home, your clothes, your husband, and your manners, then your life was successful. Reality was optional. My father, Thomas, rarely argued with her. He wasn't cruel. He simply spent years convincing himself that silence was the same thing as peace. It wasn't. My older sister, Caroline, understood our mother's rules long before I did. She knew exactly which opinions to repeat, which dresses earned compliments, which careers impressed wealthy neighbors. She mastered the art of agreeing before anyone asked her to. I never learned that language. Whenever I questioned something, I became the difficult daughter. Whenever I followed my own instincts, I was immature. Whenever I made choices my mother couldn't control, she called them mistakes. Then I met Ethan. He worked as a guidance counselor at a public high school. He drove an aging pickup truck with more miles than pride. He remembered birthdays. He volunteered on weekends. He laughed with his whole face. And he treated every person he met exactly the same, whether they wore designer suits or work boots. My family hated that, not because he was rude, because he couldn't be impressed. Mother called him pleasant but lacking ambition. Caroline described him as sweet in a very ordinary way. What neither of them understood was that Ethan never tried to become someone else just to satisfy people who would never be satisfied anyway. Being around him made me realize how exhausting I'd become. Every family dinner felt like an interview. Every holiday became another opportunity to prove I was worthy of belonging. With Ethan, none of that existed. I could simply breathe. One quiet evening in early October, after we'd cooked dinner together and nearly burned the garlic bread because we were talking too much, he looked at me across our tiny apartment kitchen. "I don't want extraordinary moments once a year," he said. "I want ordinary moments with you every day." Then he smiled.
"So will you marry me?"
I laughed before I cried. And somewhere between laughing and crying, I said yes. The next morning, I called my parents. There was a long silence before my mother finally answered. "Well," she sighed, "if we're doing this, we'll have to make sure it reflects our family properly." I should have noticed those words. Not our happiness, our family. That's where everything quietly began to go wrong. At first, I mistook my mother's involvement for support. She offered to visit venues. She insisted on comparing caterers. She volunteered to negotiate with florists because, according to her, young couples always overpay. I wanted so badly to believe this was her way of accepting Ethan. So I let her help. That was my first mistake. Within weeks, every meeting somehow revolved around her opinions. She disliked the rustic venue. Ethan and I loved because it looked too provincial. She rejected our favorite menu because it wasn't elegant enough. She replaced our simple white flower arrangements with elaborate centerpieces. I had never asked for. Whenever I protested, she smiled politely. Trust me, sweetheart. You'll thank me later. Little by little, the wedding stopped feeling like ours. It became another one of my mother's projects. Even Ethan noticed. One evening, after another planning session, he squeezed my hand as we walked back to the truck. Are we planning our wedding? He asked softly. Or your mother's? I laughed. Not because it was funny, because I didn't know how to answer. A few weeks later, she called with what sounded like the most generous offer she'd ever made. Emma, she said, let your father and me handle the payments. Vendors are difficult, contracts are confusing, and you already have enough on your plate. You've worked hard your whole life. Let us give you this. I remember feeling relieved. For the first time since getting engaged, I thought maybe everything would finally be okay. So I agreed. From that point forward, every major deposit was paid using my mother's accounts. The venue, the florist, the caterer, the rentals, even the musicians. I signed the service agreements because the wedding was legally mine. But every payment was attached to her name. At the time, it seemed like a simple administrative detail. Looking back, I was handing her every bit of leverage she would later use against me. The wedding slowly became larger than Ethan and I had ever wanted. Our guest list grew from 60 people to nearly 150. Most of the additions weren't our friends. They were business associates, country club acquaintances, neighbors my mother hadn't spoken to in years but suddenly insisted, absolutely had to attend. When I questioned it, she gave me the same answer every single time. It's not just your wedding, Emma. It reflects on the whole family. I kept compromising, one decision after another, because I still believed peace was something you earned by giving people enough of what they wanted. I couldn't have been more wrong. Then, one Wednesday afternoon, my mother called and asked me to come over. There are a few final details we need to discuss before everything is confirmed, she said. Her voice sounded perfectly calm, perfectly pleasant. Nothing about that phone call warned me that within 24 hours my entire wedding would no longer exist. The next afternoon, I drove to my parents' house believing we were going to finalize seating arrangements. Instead, I walked into silence. My father sat in his usual armchair, staring at the hardwood floor. Caroline was scrolling through her phone without looking up. My mother was waiting in the living room with a porcelain teacup resting, neatly in her hands. She didn't smile. She didn't ask how I was. She simply looked at me and said, "We've reconsidered." I frowned. Reconsidered what? The wedding. For a second, I thought I had misunderstood. What do you mean? She carefully placed her teacup onto its saucer. We've decided we're no longer willing to finance this marriage. The room felt impossibly quiet. I looked from my mother to my father. He refused to meet my eyes. I turned toward Caroline. She shrugged as if this were the most ordinary conversation in the world. But and why? Mother folded her hands. Because we've given this a great deal of thought. And Ethan simply isn't the right man for you. He's kind. I'm sure he is. He loves me. I'm sure he believes he does. He makes me happy. She sighed. Happiness isn't enough, Emma. My jaw tightened. What exactly isn't enough about him? He has no ambition. He works with children. He earns very little. He can't provide the life you've been raised to expect. I stared at her. So this is about money. It's about security. No, I answered quietly. It's about control. Her expression barely changed. You'll understand someday. I laughed. Not because anything was funny. Because if I didn't laugh, I was afraid I would scream. I looked toward my father again. Dad? Nothing. Just silence. Finally, he cleared his throat. Your mother and I made this decision together. It sounded rehearsed, like he'd repeated it several times before I arrived. Caroline finally looked up from her phone. You know, she said casually, it's probably for the best. I blinked. What? You've always rushed into things. Ethan seems nice, but honestly, I never saw this lasting. She smiled politely. Better to find out now than after the wedding. Something inside me went completely still. Years of trying to explain myself. Years of hoping they'd eventually see me. Years of believing one more conversation would finally make them understand. Gone. I picked up the blue wedding planner I'd carried with me everywhere for months, held it against my chest, and quietly said, I understand. Then I walked out. No one followed me. I sat inside my car for nearly 10 minutes before I could even start the engine. Finally, I called Ethan. He answered almost immediately. "Hey, Em." I couldn't speak. He waited. Patiently. Finally, I whispered, "They pulled everything." There was a brief silence. Then he said the words I needed most. "Come home." Not, "We'll figure it out." Not, "Don't worry." Just, "Come home." Because home wasn't a place anymore. It was him. That evening, we spread every contract across our small kitchen table. The apartment above the bakery smelled like cinnamon and fresh bread. Normally, it was comforting. That night, I barely noticed. We began calculating what we could still afford ourselves. Smaller guest list, simpler flowers, no live band, no luxury rentals. It wasn't impossible, just different. Then my phone rang. The screen displayed, "Danielle, Willow Creek Estate." I answered immediately. "Emma?" "Yes. I just wanted to verify something before releasing your date." My stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" "I'm calling about today's cancellation." Everything inside me froze. "I never canceled." Danielle hesitated. "The account holder contacted us this morning. She confirmed the reservation number, the deposit information, and stated there had been a family change of plans." I couldn't breathe. My mother did that? I'm afraid so. I closed my eyes. "When?" "About 2 hours before I called you." 2 hours. That meant she'd canceled my wedding venue. Before telling me she wasn't paying, she had already made the decision, already erased months of planning, already accepted losing the $4,000 deposit. Before I even walked into her living room, Danielle spoke gently. "If you'd like, I can hold your date for 48 hours before offering it to another couple." I swallowed. "Please. We'll do our best." After hanging up, I simply sat there. The room was completely silent. Ethan looked at me. "How far did she go?" I slowly looked around at the contracts covering our kitchen table, then answered with 2 words, "All of it." And in that exact moment, I stopped trying to save my relationship with my family. I started protecting my future instead. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard my mother's voice repeating the same sentence. "We're doing what's best for you." No, she was doing what was best for her. By sunrise, I had gone through every email, invoice, contract, and receipt connected to the wedding. At first, I was simply trying to understand the damage. Instead, I discovered something far worse. The venue hadn't been the only business my mother contacted. The florist had received an email asking them to suspend the order. The caterer had been told the wedding was under family review. Even the string quartet had been informed there was a possibility the event would no longer happen. She hadn't acted out of emotion. She'd been planning this for days, maybe even weeks. That realization hurt more than the cancellation itself. Impulsive anger can sometimes be forgiven. Carefully planned betrayal is something entirely different. The next morning, I called my college friend, Lauren. Lauren had become a contract attorney, and over the years, she'd developed an incredible talent for separating facts from emotions. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked only one question. "Who signed the service agreements?" "I did." "And whose names appear as the clients?" "Ethan and I." "What about your mother's name?" "Only on the payment information." There was a brief pause. Then Lauren said something that completely changed my perspective. "Emma, paying for a contract doesn't necessarily give someone the legal authority to cancel it." I sat upright. "What?" "Forward everything to me." Within an hour, she called back. "Your florist can't legally cancel without your approval. The caterer can't either. The contracts belong to you." My mother already canceled them. "She requested cancellations," Lauren corrected. "That doesn't automatically make them valid." For the first time in 2 days, I felt something besides heartbreak. Hope. Lauren helped me draft formal letters to every vendor. Not emotional emails. Not angry messages. Professional notices. Each one explained that I was the contracting client and that any cancellation, request submitted without my authorization, should be considered invalid. Most vendors responded within 24 hours. Beth, the florist, called me personally. "I'm so relieved you reached out," she admitted. Honestly, something about that conversation didn't sit right with me. She reinstated our order immediately. The caterer did the same. The musicians agreed to honor the original agreement. Only the venue remained uncertain. Because my mother had listed herself as the financial guarantor from the beginning. Danielle fought for us anyway. She spent nearly 2 days speaking with the owners. Eventually, she called back. I have good news. I held my breath. We can't give you the entire estate anymore, but the garden pavilion is still available. It was smaller, much smaller. Instead of 150 guests, it could hold 45. I looked across the apartment at Ethan. He smiled before I even answered. We'll take it. That afternoon, we completely rebuilt our wedding. Not my mother's version. Ours. The guest list shrank from 152 people to 44. Every unnecessary expense disappeared. The expensive champagne tower, the elaborate crystal centerpieces, the imported linens, the luxury transportation my mother insisted respectable weddings required. Gone. Instead, we kept everything that had actually mattered from the beginning. The climbing ivy, simple white roses, homemade desserts from the bakery downstairs, acoustic guitar played by Ethan's younger brother, friends, family who truly loved us, nothing else. For the first time since getting engaged, planning our wedding actually felt joyful again. But my family still had no idea. They genuinely believed there wasn't going to be a wedding at all. And I intended to let them keep believing that. A little while longer. About a week later, the phone calls started. First came Caroline. Her voicemail sounded almost cheerful. Emma, I think everyone overreacted. Mom was only trying to protect you. Let's not turn this into something bigger than it has to be. I listened to the message once, then deleted it. She still didn't understand. This wasn't about the money. It wasn't even about the wedding anymore. It was about trust. And once trust is broken, pretending nothing happened doesn't repair it. My father called next. Twice in one afternoon. He didn't leave a message. On the third attempt, he finally spoke. Emma? A long pause. I should have said something. Just 6 words. No excuses. No explanations. Only regret. For a moment, I almost called him back. Almost. But then I remembered. Him sitting in that living room, while my mother dismantled my future one, sentence at a time. Silence had been his choice. Now it would be mine. My mother, however, was different. She called every day for nearly a week. Each voicemail rewrote history a little more. I never canceled your wedding. I only paused things until you came to your senses. You misunderstood my intentions. I was trying to save you from making the biggest mistake of your life. Not once did she acknowledge what she had actually done. Not once did she apologize for pretending to be me. Not once did she mention the thousands of dollars she had willingly thrown away just to stop the ceremony from happening. Every message ended exactly the same way. When you're ready to talk like an adult, call me. I never did. 3 weeks before the ceremony, invitations for our new wedding were mailed. 44 envelopes. No more. Every single name belonged to someone who had stood beside us without conditions. Friends, neighbors, co-workers, Ethan's family. People who celebrated our happiness instead of trying to redesign it. There wasn't a single invitation addressed to my parents or to Caroline. I knew they would eventually find out. Small cities always talk. Sure enough, only 2 days after the invitations arrived, my phone exploded with messages. Why weren't we invited? What is going on? Is this some kind of punishment? I answered each of them with exactly the same sentence. The guest list is complete. Nothing more. Nothing less. No accusations. No arguments. No emotional speeches. Just the truth. Because for the first time in my life, I realized I didn't owe anyone an explanation for protecting my own peace. And on a warm Saturday morning in June, while my family was still convinced there would be no wedding at all, I zipped up my dress, looked at Ethan waiting beneath the ivy-covered pavilion, smiled, and walked toward the happiest day of my life. The ceremony itself was everything we had hoped for, precisely because it belonged to us and not to anyone else's expectations. There were no elaborate performances, no endless speeches meant to impress strangers, no carefully curated image for society pages. There were 44 chairs, every single one filled by someone who had chosen us, rather than our family name. When I walked down the aisle, Soren smiled the same quiet smile that had made me fall in love with him in the first place. Nothing about that moment felt expensive. It felt priceless. Afterward, we ate dinner under strings of warm lights while children ran through the garden laughing. People stayed far later than the schedule, allowed because nobody wanted the evening to end. That was the first celebration of my life where I never once worried about whether my mother approved. 3 days later, the phone calls started again. This time they sounded different. My mother no longer spoke as though she were giving instructions. She sounded uncertain. "People are talking," she said during one voicemail. "I've had several friends ask why there weren't any family photographs from your wedding." I listened without responding. She continued, "I think we should fix this misunderstanding before it gets out of hand." A misunderstanding. Apparently, canceling your daughter's wedding was now a misunderstanding. I deleted the message. A week later, my father showed up at the bakery. He didn't come upstairs. He simply stood outside until Soren noticed him through the window. "I'll handle this," I said. Dad looked older than I remembered. Not physically, just tired. "I wanted to congratulate you," he said quietly. "Thank you." I should have stopped her. "You could have." "I know." We stood there for several seconds. "I don't expect forgiveness," he continued. "I just wanted you to know, I know I failed you." For the first time in years, I believed him. Not because the words erased anything. Because they didn't try to. Taran never apologized. Instead, she sent an email explaining that families simply had disagreements, and mature people eventually moved on. I noticed something interesting. Not once did she mention what our mother had actually done. Not once. Because acknowledging the facts would have required acknowledging responsibility. I archived the email without replying. Several months passed. Life settled into something wonderfully ordinary. Soren and I still lived above the bakery. Every morning smelled like fresh cinnamon rolls. Every evening we cooked dinner together. Sometimes we'd walk through the neighborhood, holding hands without saying much at all. For years I had believed happiness needed to look impressive. It turns out happiness often looks like grocery shopping with someone who remembers you prefer crunchy peanut butter. One Saturday afternoon, Marisol called. "I thought you'd like to know something." "What happened?" She laughed softly. "Your mother came by the venue." I blinked. "What?" She asked if we still had photographs from the original wedding plans. And I told her those files had been closed. "What did she say?" Marisol paused. She stood in the garden for a few minutes, then left. That image stayed with me. Not because I enjoyed imagining her disappointment, because for the first time I realized she had lost something too. Not control, something much bigger. The opportunity to witness her daughter's happiest day. No amount of reputation or influence could ever buy that moment back. About a year after the wedding, Soren surprised me with a small wooden box. Inside were the pressed flowers from my original pale blue wedding binder. He had carefully framed them beneath glass. "I thought they deserved better than staying inside a folder," he said. I cried harder opening that gift than I had during our wedding ceremony. Because those flowers represented everything that had almost been taken away. And everything that survived anyway. People sometimes ask whether I regret not inviting my family after everything was repaired. The answer surprises them. No, not because I'm angry. Because that wedding belonged to the people who protected our peace. Forgiveness and access are not the same thing. You can wish someone well without giving them front row seats to your life. That lesson took me 32 years to learn. Today, my relationship with my mother exists within carefully drawn boundaries. We exchange holiday cards. Occasionally, we have lunch. The conversations stay polite. Surface level. She has never fully admitted what happened. I've accepted that she probably never will. Oddly enough, accepting that gave me more freedom than waiting for an apology ever did. Dad visits every few months. He and Soren somehow bonded over restoring old furniture. Watching them work together in the garage sometimes feels like watching two men quietly repair something much larger than a wooden table. Not everything can be fixed, but some things can still become better. The pale blue wedding binder still sits on the bookshelf in our bedroom. Inside are the original sketches, fabric samples, vendor notes, and one handwritten letter from my mother. I keep it there intentionally, not to reopen old wounds, to remind myself how close I came to believing someone else had the right to decide whether I deserved happiness. They never did. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's this. The people who truly love you don't make your joy conditional. They don't threaten it. They don't cancel it when you refuse to become who they want you to be. Real love doesn't ask you to earn your place at the table. It saves you a seat before you even arrive. Sometimes losing the version of family you spent your whole life trying to please is exactly what allows you to build the family you've been searching for all along. And looking back now, I don't remember the venue that was almost taken away. I remember 44 smiling faces, white roses, an acoustic guitar, the smell of fresh bread drifting across a garden, and a man who looked at me as though there was nowhere else in the world he'd rather be. That was always the wedding I was meant to have. If this story resonated with you, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear whether you've ever found unexpected freedom after letting go of someone else's expectations. And if you enjoyed the story, consider sharing it with someone who might need the reminder. We'll see you in the next one.